Ways that we try to understand what is driving polarization is to look at where there are large misperceptions about different communities in the US. The framework that we use to uncover misperceptions is through measuring what we call perception gaps. So a perception gap is the difference between what we imagine a group believes in versus what that group actually believes in. And under this framework, we found that there are three big myths about faith in America. These are myths that are preventing pastors and church communities from playing a much greater role in overcoming divisions. And when I say pastors and church communities here, I'm referring to largely faith leaders and faith communities. It's just much easier to encompass all the groups with a more simplistic, oversimplifying term. But the first myth that we uncover about faith in America is that when Americans, when viewing faith communities, especially Christian communities, Americans often look through the lens of politics, especially partisan politics. This is especially true for evangelicals, and this is the reason why some Christians are no longer using the term evangelical to describe themselves, because the term has become so politicized in our discourse and media coverage. And this trend to view faith communities primarily through a political or partisan lens is especially visible on social media. Here we analyze the words most commonly paired with evangelicals, American Jews, and American Muslims across social media platforms in the past 2 years. As you can see here, most of the frequently used words are quite political. Here we see like Donald Trump or Republican, and for the words associated with Jewish and Muslim Americans, it all has to do with the war in Israel and Gaza. And far fewer posts and discussions online actually reference the daily lives of Americans of faith, whether it's matters of theology or religious observations, or even major holidays across different traditions, such as Ramadan or Easter or the Jewish high holidays. Our research, in fact, found that Americans have huge perception gaps, especially when it comes to evangelicals. Here in our surveys, we asked evangelicals, what's the most important part of your identity? Is it politics or faith or family or your job? And we found that only 4% of evangelical Christians say being a Republican or being a Democrat is their most important identity. However, the general American public at large imagines that 41% of evangelicals say political party affiliation is their most important identity, which is 10 times more than reality. Moreover, only 1 in 5 evangelical Christians believe that being a good Christian means supporting the Republican Party. But Americans imagine the number is 3 times that, over half at 55%. And in contrast to these misperceptions, we actually found that very few Americans say their political identity is the most important part of who they are. When we ask which of the following identities is most important to you personally, Americans actually chose their faith identity, their family role, such as being a parent, being a sibling, or being an uncle. And only 9% of Americans say being a Democrat or being a Republican is most important to who they are. And when it comes to relationship with their faith, most Americans actually turn to their faith to deepen their relationship with God rather than to advance political causes. We found that the majority of Americans say they turn to their faith for a spiritual relationship and to find comfort during difficult times. And only 6% of Americans say they turn to their faith to express their political views. And this is the case when we zero in on South Carolina as well. We see that most South Carolinians say they turn to their faith to deepen their relationship with God, to find comfort during difficult times, to look for guidance on important questions in life. And only 10% say they turn to their faith to express their political views. Lastly, very few Americans view partisan affiliation as a key to religious devotion. Here we see that less than 1/5 of evangelical Christians say being a good Christian means supporting the Democratic Party or supporting the Republican Party. And similarly, we see very low levels of agreement among other groups as well. So Americans across different faith communities don't consider voting habits or party affiliation to be sort of a litmus test for what makes a good believer or follower of their religion. What these findings tell us is that in our polarized age, we too often allow politics to shape the way we view each other and view our neighbors, when most of the time, for most Americans, their political identity is simply not the most important part of who they are. And they want to be seen beyond just who they vote for and what are their views on different political issues. The second myth that we uncover in the study is that Americans are so often exposed to the story of how religion is in decline that they significantly underestimate the importance of faith to their fellow Americans, especially the importance of faith to young people. Here, as all of us know, there's a common perception of religious communities that faith is on the decline. And this emphasis on the dechurching narrative or the decline in religious services is undeniably justified. We've been seeing statistics in the past 2 decades that demonstrate that trend. And we know that religious nuns or people who don't have a religious affiliation, the number has been on a rise. But this narrative of emptying pews and religion becoming not important anymore is not the full story. We found that faith remains personally important to most Americans, whether they show up at a place of worship or not. Here we see over 7 in 10 Americans say being a Christian or Catholic or Jewish, Muslim, Latter-day Saint is important to who they are. And you might be thinking, what about the generational gap? What about the young people? And we actually found that 2/3 of Gen Z, people who are born after 1996, say that their faith is important to them, which is only 10% less or lower than baby boomers. So it really begs the question how much of the generational gap can be overplayed in our conversations about faith in America. And when it comes to South Carolina, we found that 3/4 of South Carolinians say that their faith identity is important to who they are. And back to the Gen Z question, we actually found that when we ask a question, why do you turn to your faith or your faith communities? We found that Gen Z are slightly less likely than older generations to say that they turn to their faith for spiritual relationship and to find comfort during difficult times. Gen Z are actually more likely than older generations to turn to the faith for a sense of belonging and to be part of a community. And this is perhaps because Gen Z often have the lowest sense of belonging in society and the weakest networks of relationships of any age group. And I think this finding really is especially important as we think about the epidemic of loneliness that the Surgeon General has talked about in recent years and the future of faith. As places of worship grapple with declining service attendance, what we see from the previous insight is that they can offer young people not only spiritual connection and guidance, but they also have the opportunities to engage with younger folks through providing a sense of belonging and community that young people often don't find anymore because of the pervasive reliance on social media and experience with the pandemic. So I think it really points to the opportunity for faith communities to engage with youth and also to build social cohesion. The third myth that we uncovered in our research study is the idea that religious people are intolerant. In public discourse about religion and public life, we often see faith associated with fundamentalism and intolerance. For example, we asked around 100 Americans on our research panel what comes to mind when you see the term evangelical Christians. Many respondents used words such as Christian nationalism, narrow-minded point of view. And that conversation really dominates a lot of people's perceptions of different faith communities. But when we know that's not true, and these perceptions are far, far from reality, we found that most Christians, around 8 in 10 of them, actually want the US to be a place where people of all religions feel that they belong. And similarly, we see a majority of Jewish, Muslim Americans agreeing with this ideal of religious pluralism. And if we look at the disagreement numbers here, we can see that only 5% of evangelicals and 5% of Muslims disagree with this statement, which is a very small number. And when it comes to South Carolina, we found that the majority of South Carolinians also support this idea of religious pluralism. However, again, we find large perception gaps between the actual beliefs of different faith communities who are in favor of pluralism and the American public's perceptions of them. Here we see that Americans think only half of evangelicals and half of Muslim Americans would support religious pluralism, when we know from the previous slide that the majority of evangelical Christians and the majority of Muslims are supportive of this ideal. Moreover, in our research, we also found that 3/4 of Americans, including the majority across all faith communities, are open to interacting with someone from a different religious background. So this commitment to religious pluralism is not only seen by this verbal agreement with this ideal, but that people are willing and open to actually participate in interfaith engagement that lives up to this ideal of religious pluralism. Why this insight on misperceptions matters is that the more entrenched people's assumptions about the intolerance of the other side or the intolerance of particular religious communities, the harder it is to build trust and connection. So for organizations and leaders who are working on improving interfaith relations, it is particularly important to emphasize the different groups and communities' support for religious pluralism. So people have their guards down and are more open to building personal relationships and building interests for interfaith engagement. Now that we know there are misperceptions about different faith communities, I want to make two quick points on why is it important to address misperceptions. For example, here I'm going to use an example around evangelical Christians and the Republican Party. We found that Americans overestimate the percentage of evangelicals who are Republican. So around and less than half of evangelical Christians actually identify as Republican, but non-evangelicals think that over 60% of evangelicals are Republican. And this misperception that ties evangelical Christians with the Republican Party, these misperceptions don't exist in a vacuum and have consequences in reality. So what this graph here shows is we found that the more Democrats and independents overestimate the percentage of evangelicals who are Republicans, the more negatively they feel towards all evangelicals. So put simply, the bigger your perception gap is on evangelicals, the more you dislike all evangelicals. And essentially, what we're seeing here is polarization and partisan animosity that Democrats and independents have towards Republicans is also sort of misdirected towards all people who identify as evangelical because of this perceived association between evangelical Christians and the Republican Party. We call this phenomenon collateral contempt, which is the tendency for animosity to spill over to religious groups that are perceived to be aligned with one political team. And as you can see in the graph, it's a linear relationship. And this phenomenon of collateral contempt is also found towards other communities such as Catholics and Muslim Americans. And it would be really interesting for us to continue this line of inquiry as well. And one other point I want to make is that misperceptions also contribute to an environment where many Americans feel under attack, judged, and misrepresented. And this sentiment of fear and threats is particularly salient among evangelicals and religious minorities. Here we see that around 2/3 of evangelical Christians and Jewish Americans say that their religion is under attack. And around 2/3 of Jewish and Muslim Americans and more than 7 in 10 evangelical Christians say they feel that their groups are judged more than others and that they are misrepresented by political and media elites. The reason why I want to flag this is that when people feel under attack or threatened, they go into this fight or flight mode, and it's hard for them to engage with others in a healthy and constructive way when they feel that they're threatened or their status is threatened. Therefore, it is particularly urgent for us to reduce people's misperceptions and reduce people's perceptions of threat. And one way to do that is to counter misperceptions and build healthier communities and better connections with one another across lines of differences so that our perceptions reflect reality more. And through conversations with Americans across the country, we also just heard from people across different faith traditions saying that they just want to be seen like everybody else, diverse in their beliefs and traditions, but united by common values and life pursuits. I'll play a clip from Bradley, who's a 44-year-old Muslim from California.
I would like all Americans to understand that just because we're Muslim Americans doesn't make us any less American than they are. We like baseball, we like hot dogs, albeit beef hot dogs. We like playing with our children. We like to do all the same things that every other American likes to do. Just we pray 5 times a day. We go to a church on a Friday instead of a Sunday, and we believe that all of us are equally, blessed and going to make it to heaven. Whereas, unfortunately,
And we really heard this desire to be seen all across the board. And Alicia, I really appreciate the poem you shared earlier about everyone has a voice, but not everyone feels heard and seen. And if we can really elevate these voices and counter people's assumptions, it really lives up to a lot of the demand that we're seeing from different faith communities. Lastly, I just want to make a few point on how we can address and correct misperceptions. First of all, understanding what drives misperceptions may provide parts of the answer on how to correct these misperceptions. Our research found that the more liberal a person is, the more likely they have a bigger perception gap around evangelicals. But conversely, the more conservative one is, the more likely they are to have misperceptions about Muslims. Moreover, we also found that the more time a person spends on social media, the bigger their perception gaps on evangelical Christians. So these factors all show that in order to correct misperceptions, one way is we can target liberal-leaning folks when it comes to their understanding of evangelical Christians and target conservative folks when it comes to understanding of around Muslim communities. And especially targeting especially those who get their information about different faith communities, not from personal relationships, but from social media. So targeting these folks might allow us to correct misperceptions people hold most effectively. Second, elevating common ground across different religious groups can also strengthen our resilience against efforts that divide communities and stir up fear. Here we see that kindness and respect for human dignity are the most important values across different religious communities. And through emphasizing these common ground and shared values can build the first steps in building personal relationships. And thirdly, we found that elevating a diverse range of voices and perspectives to greater prominence, especially on social media, may help correct misperceptions, especially the voices that contain nuances or challenge existing assumptions about a group. For example, we can hear from Douglas, who is a very conservative evangelical Christian from Georgia.
God's welcoming of all different, people of all political beliefs. And he's not just, doesn't just love Republicans or doesn't just love Democrats or any other political party. So
And here we can hear from Melissa, who's an evangelical woman who wants to acknowledge the influence of Christianity on America, but also emphasize that you don't need to be Christian to be American. And she said, our founding fathers did not establish a national religion. Our country was founded by people trying to avoid state religion. So no, you don't have to be Christian to be America. And I'm highlighting these quotes because our research shows that showing people personal stories and personal voices are sometimes more effective in changing people's minds than using statistics and numbers. So combining all these tools that we have and especially elevating personal stories would be particularly helpful in changing people's minds and correcting misperceptions. The last point I want to make here is that there is a huge, extensive need for spiritual guidance on how to navigate polarization. Around half of Americans who attend services regularly say that they want religious leaders at their place of worship to provide guidance on how to navigate political division, how to talk to people whose views are different, and how to navigate demographic or cultural changes. What we're seeing here is that there is a real potential for leadership from faith communities, not to play partisan politics, but to help guide people through our deeply divided times. And this demand is also seen in the context of South Carolina. We see that around half of South Carolinians who attend services regularly want spiritual guidance on navigating polarization, but particularly they're eager for spiritual guidance on how to navigate cultural changes. And before we open it up for Q&A, I want to really emphasize the two things that we want you all to walk away with from today's presentation. The first is that we have huge misperceptions when it comes to different faith communities, but these misperceptions are not unmovable, they're not unchangeable. We can shift them and we can correct them by emphasizing common values, by elevating diverse and personal voices. And the second point is that faith communities and faith leaders, as we can see here, can and should play a greater role in countering polarization. In our age of increasing distrust in institutions, our research found that people still have very high level of trust in their local faith leaders, and they want to turn to their leaders for spiritual guidance on a range of issues. And a lot of the times, the values that faith communities emphasize, such as humility, self-reflections, community, and service, is really needed in conversations on polarization and building healthier communities. So what we really want to emphasize from today's call is that there is a role that faith communities can play in building stronger and healthier communities. And we hope that our conversations today can help you advance that goal and the important work that you do. And with that, let's turn to Q&A and see what questions you all may have.
Doesn't look like we have any in the chat yet. Are there any? She can
I
hear.
wondered in regard to political affiliation, did you all ask the question of the groups? Did you vote in a recent election, either national, local, or state? And if you did, if there's a political affiliation that the candidates espoused, which political affiliation did you vote for?
Yes, we did ask those questions on vote choices, and first of all, whether they have voted in the past in 2022 and 2020, and what were their vote choices and what's their party affiliation. We capture all of that.
Coco, are you able to, and I may have missed this, go into what you found? Because I'm curious to, understand. I understand that what people believe about themselves is different from the perceptions that someone else may have, but how did that line up with their actual actions?
Yes, that's a really, really great question. The survey questions we have here are all self-reporting attitudes, right? And what does it mean when there's a gap between what people say they believe versus the behaviors they have in real life? And I think a lot of the times, first of all, the answers survey respondents give or Americans give in their answers to surveys really reflect what the ideals they have and what they aspire to do. And this is still a really important part to recognize that perhaps we don't really see, for example, the point about how very few Americans see their political party affiliation as the most important part of who they are. Even though we might not see that in our daily lives, or we don't think this is true in some of the communities we encounter, at least I think it's important to acknowledge that this is what many Americans aspire to be in our country. And that's a really important starting point. And on the, I think that a lot of question that we have got is there's the support for religious pluralism or the agreement that a religion does not equal a political party affiliation. But there are also times where people vote for a particular candidate who might not espouse or reflect the values that they prioritize or the voters prioritize. And I think one way to understand that is to look at the statistics or the findings we showed earlier about the perceptions of threats and how so many Americans from different faith communities feel that they're under attack and misrepresented. And for some, and from social psychology research, we found that when people feel that they're threatened, they might be more likely to turn to who they see as a strong leader who can protect their interests and their values. And I think that mode of being threatened is a really, really important part to acknowledge and something that we should work towards correcting so that people are not in the fight or flight mode when it comes to choosing a candidate who might not reflect their values, but they perceived as a protector of their lifestyle or values.
There are two questions on Zoom. So the first is, when was the survey taken? Do you feel after the first quarter of this year with the new administration that the number would trend differently? Or do you think your data would stay the same?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm excited if we have the resources this year to update this research as well and see how the numbers shake out. I think based on some of the conversations we've had with different faith communities and faith leaders, it seems like some of the misperceptions are still relevant. A lot of times, I think especially now, many faith communities, especially for evangelical Christians and Muslim and Jewish Americans, the conversations around these communities are still very much coming from the lens of partisan politics. So I think some of the misperceptions around these groups still persist. But I think when it comes to questions such as what do you prioritize in what issues do you prioritize, or do you think what kind of qualities do you look for in your leaders? I think that might shake out differently, but the questions around religiosity or the reasons why people turn to faith, I think that would remain evergreen because that's a part of many Americans, their daily lives, separate from what's happening in the news or in our political sphere.
Thank you. The next question was, what is your definition of religious pluralism?
Great question. In the survey, we define it as whether people agree with the statement, the US should be a place where people of all religion and people of no religion feel that they belong. So we intentionally use the word belong to define pluralism and also to be inclusive of not only people who are religious, but also people who don't have a religious affiliation.
Question. I guess I'd like to get your perception. If you had asked the question about affiliation rather than asking Republican or Democrat, you had asked, do you support Trump or do you support Biden? Do you think that your answers would have been different? And the reason I ask is because my perception is that lately politics has become more about the individual person than about the political party. That's what I see. So anyway, if you can answer that possibly.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think there still will be misperceptions, but perhaps the magnitude would be different. But I totally agree with you that it seems like in our particular current context, there's almost, for some communities, there's a greater loyalty or affinity towards one political leader as opposed to a political party. So I think the numbers would shake out differently, but I think the rationale behind the misperceptions is that what the misperceptions reveal is when people think about, let's say, evangelical Christians, they think about the segment of white conservative evangelical Christians who have voted for Trump consecutively in the past 3 elections, when in reality, the term evangelical Christian encompasses a much more diverse group of Americans across racial groups, across religiosities, across religious affiliations. And what we want to highlight is when we use the term, it encompasses so many Americans, and we should not only look at a religious community through the lens of vote choices and partisan affiliation.
So, question. My experience has been that people are not as likely to get into the nuances of issues, that it's a lot easier to just be binary. You're either all in or all out. And I'll give an example. So there's something called DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. And you see a lot of that now where people are like, that stuff is terrible, never should have been it, get rid of it, or we're gonna fight to keep it. And it seems like, I mean, I'm being too simplistic, I'm sure, but the answer is maybe let's look at the programs.
Mhm.
What's good about it, and let's keep that. And if you feel like it's gone too far, fair enough, let's talk about it. But I don't know, that's kind of where I'm hoping we get, but you see that whether it's a legislator or somebody running for office, that it's too, let's not get into nuance, it's just easier to say, this is evil, we hate it, as opposed to saying, wait a minute, maybe let's do a deeper dive and see if we can find something that's really a good result. So I don't know if there's a question there or not, but it's just, how do we get to a point where people aren't just, I'm gonna think one way, as opposed to, I'm open to at least discussing it. And it's kind of like, if you are open, we find this with, you're a sellout. You know, if you're willing to talk to the other side, you're a sellout. You're not staying true to your values.
Yeah, I completely agree with your points there. I think especially when it comes to DEI and more in common, we've been thinking about this a lot too, and also potentially doing more research on Americans' attitudes towards DEI. And the reason why we want to do that is precisely your point about how when people talk about DEI, or at least the media discourse or the political discourse on DEI is so simplistic without actually engaging with what are we talking about when we talk about DEI? Are we talking about norms around engagement or how to speak about different communities, or is it about resource allocation? And a lot of the times the conversations we have lump all of these together. And as you said, there's almost like a knee-jerk reaction. Oh, DEI, then I'm against it, or have a certain reaction. But I think it would be really interesting and important to parse that out and uncover the nuances that people have. What are they actually supportive of, and what do they still want to keep, and what are they uncomfortable with? So through really understanding these nuances, I think is the stepping stone of having an actual healthy conversation on this topic.
I think it would also be really interesting to look at it through the same lens of the feeling of perceived attack. You know, whether there's correlations there. I mean, obviously, there's different lenses than just religion, but I think that would be an interesting addition to that. So we look forward to your research findings.
Thank you.
And it is 1:29. I know that there's still so much to you know, talk about, because that your presentation, your research is pretty deep. And if we wanted to learn more, if we wanted to, you know, ask questions that maybe we don't have an opportunity to ask right now, how do we do that?
Yeah, I can jump in here. Well, we've listed our emails here on the PowerPoint. If any of you want to reach out to us anytime, you're welcome to do so. We also have the website for the entire report. So if you want to go through it and really dig into the findings that we have, you're welcome to do so. In the future, we may have some more webinars that you can attend. And also just feel free to share, you know, things on social media. If you find something interesting in the report, you know, feel free to tag us and share it. You know, share with your community, and you're always welcome to stay in touch with us. So we're happy to talk to anyone. So
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you. Thank you.
This was fantastic. For those of us in the room, we do have a survey that we would appreciate you filling out. We also had a sign in. If you didn't get a chance to sign in, that's how we're tracking who attends our events. For those of you who are online, we already have you noted through Zoom, but we do have a survey that we'd like for everyone to complete. And so if you can hold for just a few minutes, I didn't have it queued up, but I'll share that QR code in just a few on this on the Zoom as well. I do want to make a couple of announcements real quick. We have 2 Just Faith programs that are coming up, and when we talk about nuances, those Just Faith programs are a great place for us to really go deep into the nuances of different issues. One that we have that starts next Friday is our hunger program, and it goes into the causes of hunger in our country and beyond. And that one will be done in collaboration with Mill Village Farm and Food Share Program. So please, if you are interested, you can just let me know today and I'll get you signed up for that. Also, if you enjoy our Fourth Friday conversations, most of you have been to a Fourth Friday conversation before. And so hopefully you're back because you have really gotten something from it. This year, we are hoping to have individuals or organizations sponsor our Fourth Friday series. So if you are interested in doing more to support the work that we're doing, we don't charge for pretty much anything that we do, but we are asking for financial support and sponsors for our Fourth Friday series. Next month, our conversation is going to be on racial displacement and gentrification in our community. And our March conversation will be focused on gun violence prevention. So again, please do put those Fourth Fridays on your calendar and join us here. It's interesting that you mentioned DEI because that's actually one of the conversations that we'll have this year as well. So we're looking forward to kind of figuring out what exactly that will look like, but we do plan to do a Fourth Friday conversation about DEI. So are there any questions, last minute questions, or anything else that maybe I forgot to say before we close out? Again, those of you who are online, if you will give me just like a minute to pull up the QR code for y'all to be able to complete. And in the room, I'll pass around our survey for you
This
to.
worked fine when I did it.
Oh, thank you. If you'll pass those around. Oh, and Ben and Coco, I will be sending a copy of our Finding Common Ground, Leaning In to Listen. This is where I was able to get that poem that we have that I shared earlier. So you'll be able to see that one and others that were written during our last forum last year. So thank you again for being with us. We really appreciate your insight and look forward to staying connected.